everyone. We're going to get started here today. Thank you so much for coming out to the Indiana Historical Society, where we connect Hoosiers to the past in a variety of different types of programming and exhibits. Thank you so much for joining us today for our talk with Kathleen on The Miniature Painter Revealed. If you haven't gotten a chance to get your copy, I see a couple scattered around the audience. We do have it available up in the Basile History Market directly above my head. It is also available online. We'll do the book signing right after the discussion today, and so if you don't have your book and want to grab it, you can, and Kathleen will come and sign copies just right out here at the end of the discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen in just a moment, but for those that don't know Kathleen, Kathleen is a freelance writer and historical researcher whose work has been published in regional New England publications such as Boston Magazine and other newspapers. She's also the host of People Hidden in History, a podcast that highlights fascinating people in the arts and politics who are unknown to the general public. And if you haven't started listening to it yet, please do. It's one of my favorites since the moment I started talking to Kathleen, so please add it to your podcast listening, viewing pleasure. Kathleen has been a speaker at museums, historical societies, libraries, history camps, and more, and presents on Amalia Kussner. And while she, of course, lives in Massachusetts now, we're very fortunate that she returned to her roots here in Indiana to give this presentation today. So with that, Kathleen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Bethany. I just want to make sure you all can hear me. If I talk at this level, we're good. Okay. I just love giving this presentation because the story of Amalia Kussner's life, it's really on many different levels and many different tracks. Obviously, she was an artist. We'll talk about her art and technique. But she was very, very adept at promoting herself. She never would have had this career unless she could put herself out in front of the public. She knew how to work with society, etc. And then, of course, this is during the Gilded Age when all these other interesting things are going on. You have the railroad tycoons, you had the suffragists, you had the start of unions. It was just a very, very dynamic time. And her life, through her artwork, took her all over the world. So again, who was she? And I'll talk about this at the very end, but she was a very complex woman. If you were to ask me right now, really what was her personality, really what was her motivation, I couldn't tell you. She was many things, and she was a little bit like a chameleon, I think. So she was born during the Civil War. She was born in Greencastle, Indiana during the Civil War, which I think is very interesting. Some of her relatives actually fought in the Civil War and they did survive. Her parents were first-generation Germans. I think her father came over from Darmstadt. Lorenz Kussner, he came from a musical family. And you might say, well, again, what is your connection? I am distantly related to her. And when I was a little girl, my grandmother had one of those beautiful gold curio cabinets, just gorgeous. Anybody, your relatives, great aunts, grandmothers, find and mysterious things in those cabinets. But we had 3 of Amalia's miniatures, and I would ask Grandma, well, who did that, Grandma? And she said, oh, that was Amalia Kussner. She painted the Prince of Wales, soon to be Edward VII. He was sweet on her and gave her a couple of pieces of jewelry. And as a little girl, I did see one of those pieces of jewelry. It was designed by René Lalique, who's more famous for his glass designs. And it was sort of a triangle with a suspended emerald. It was just gorgeous. It did get sold, but I did grow up seeing that. But the point I'm trying to make is that's all I knew about her. So my vision was she went to England, had this wonderful session with the prince, came back and had the rest of her life in Indiana, and nothing could be further from the truth. So my real in-depth research started 5 years ago. During the pandemic, I was furloughed from my job, many of us were, and I thought, what better time to do research? And many research institutions, museums, what have you, were very willing to talk remotely because nobody could visit them. I connected with a group in England, a couple of museums, Slope Art Museum, so it was a very fertile time. Okay, so Amalia was born into a middle-class family. Initially, they did live in Greencastle. They soon moved to Terra Haute, Indiana. That's where she spent most of her formative years. Her father, Lorenz Kussner, was expert at musical repair business. He did pianos, organs, maybe some other instruments. He was also a little bit of a composer. His son Albert, the older brother to Amalia, became a very famous piano music composer. We'll talk about him in a minute. But Amalia grew up in the floor above her father's store. Her father was able to buy what was originally a bank building in the 1860s, but the first floor became his repair shop. She's on the second floor. I'm sure she grew up hearing music being played on pianos, probably Bach and things like that. And there are records that she started to sketch scenery from the second floor windows looking out in Terra Haute. And here's Terra Haute, 1880. This very nice image actually comes from the Library of Congress. Amalia would have been about 17 at this time. It would have been her high school years. You can see the Wabash River. I love this. I think it's just absolutely marvelous. So let's just briefly talk about her brother, Albert Kussner. He dedicated a piece to her called Moon Moth. Is anybody familiar with the moon moth? It's a very ephemeral, it's also an endangered insect, I believe. When it is born or it comes out of its cocoon, it's only around for something like 7-8 weeks, and its full purpose is to reproduce. It isn't even able to eat, if you will, but they're a moth with a very wide wingspan. It's pretty colors of yellow and green, and it's such an ephemeral creature, if you will. It reminded Albert of Amalia, so you see he's dedicated this piece to Amalia. Now, some of these publications you'll see in a second, it actually has a photo of Amalia. And again, just very briefly about Albert, this is a list of some of his pieces. I love the names of some of his pieces. Dance of the Wood Nymphs, When Daisies Sleep. I never knew they slept, but he thought they did. Jasmine Waltz, just beautiful pieces. He actually came to international fame, not quite the level of Amalia, but pretty close. So let's talk a little bit about Amalia's formative years. She did take art lessons at St. Mary of the Woods Academy, which is now a college. It's a liberal arts college. And she also took some drawing lessons at Terra Haute High School, and some of her sketches are in the book, by the way. They came from the Vigo County Library, much appreciated. And she started to specialize and get interested in miniatures. The story goes that her father gave her a miniature as a little girl, and she was very fascinated. So she certainly started out doing regular sketches, but she did start to specialize in the 1880s. She actually started her own business. And because her brother at this point was in Chicago, he started to get into a very rich clientele, and Amalia started to get more important people to do portraits of, and also her rate, what she could charge for her miniatures went up. But New York City, Amalia knew if she really wanted to get anywhere in the art world at this time, she needed to be in New York City. And this was really at the height of the Gilded Age. For those of you who may have seen the series on HBO, The Gilded Age, it takes place in the 1880s when you have the ruling families of the Astors and Vanderbilts. They're pretty much in force at this point, 8 years later. She's invited to New York by her friend Alice Fisher. Alice Fisher at this point is an actress on Broadway, another Terra Haute girl. A lot of famous people came out of Terra Haute. And this is actually the train station in New York City she would have arrived on.
Is she the Fisher that's related to the Fisher for the race car track?
It could be. Maybe we'll
Jane
talk
Fisher,
about that
I think.
later.
Okay.
All right. So let's briefly talk about what the Gilded Age was. We talked a little bit at the beginning, of the time she lived through, but it was a time of rapid economic, technological, political, and social transformations. It was a very, very dynamic time. The actual term is mostly attributed to Mark Twain, and he says a period that glittered on the surface but would corrupt underneath. Obviously, there were some very negative things during this time. There were many poor immigrants whose backs, that the railroads were built on, etc. But it was a very interesting time. The rulers were the wealthy tycoons, in industries like railroads, mining, financial, banking, etc. Of course, we know names like Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Rockefeller. And then there was a established elite group established by Mrs. Lena Astor, the Mrs. Astor. She basically self-appointed herself the queen of New York society in the Gilded Age. And she would have these grand balls, and the story goes that with her balls and the size of her mansion, you couldn't have more than 400. So she and Ward McAllister, and you may not know who he is, but he became her confidant. and her go-to guy, and he would help steer her through society. Oh, this is a couple you should have on your list. This couple you shouldn't have on your list. So they were very much a team, if you will. And this is a very important point I want to make. These rulers and their wives wanted to be considered the royalty of America, and they wanted to be portrayed as such, and you'll see that here shortly. All right, these are two very important women that were in Amalia Kussner's life. The woman on the left, if I didn't tell you that she came from New York, wouldn't you think this was like a Parisian or European painting? Very, very elegant. You should think of royalty, doesn't it? This was Mrs. Theodore Havemeyer. Her husband, his wealth came from the sugarcane industry in the Caribbean, and her reason to live was to bring art over to the United States from Europe. And Impressionism was very popular at this time, and she was a great supporter of Mary Cassatt. We know Mary Cassatt with the beautiful paintings of the children and the babies, etc. But also, Mary Cassatt was her advisor. What art should we bring over to the museum? So we'll see how Amalia connects with her. Now we have Minnie Paget. She was a dollar heiress, and very briefly in terms of what dollar heiresses were, it was a time where these young ladies came from fabulously wealthy money. They might have actually directly inherited the money, whatever, but their family had money, and they became very appealing to the British royalty and the peerage of the royalty. They were having an economic downturn in England. In fact, I think it had to do with the price of wheat. We were underselling or underpricing them, and their wheat was not selling. So there were economic hard times, and these men very much wanted to maintain their castles. And by marrying these ladies with money, they were able to do that. So we'll have a connection here with Amalia shortly. All right, I won't spend too much time on this, but Minnie Paget's father, he was a hotelier from Boston, and he died young, and a lot of his inheritance actually went directly to her. But one other point about Minnie, she did marry into British royalty. She became part of the Prince of Wales, who eventually became Edward VII, his inner social circle, and it was called the Marlborough set. He lived with his wife in Marlborough House, but it was a very close set of politicians, influential people, the peerage, if you will, counts, dukes, that type of thing. And when he became king, this set of people went with him and became his very close advisors. But there were a number of women that were in the circle, and Amalia painted a lot of them. Some of them were truly his mistresses. Amalia's first years in New York City. She arrives in New York, and you have to understand at this point, Amalia has a very high opinion of herself, and she's probably mostly right. So she envisions coming into New York City. Oh, everybody's going to want my art. I'll sell it for these high prices. Life is good. Didn't happen quite so fast. But I think, again, to Alice Fisher, she got Amalia a job at Tiffany's. And by 1892, Tiffany's is very prominent. Of course, we all know the beautiful glasswork, etc. And she's doing miniatures. And I think these miniatures go into the Tiffany frames. Well, an incredible thing happened 4 weeks ago. I was contacted by Bonham's Auction House, and they said, we just found you on the internet. We wanted to get in touch because we're going to be selling an Amalia Kussner miniature. And not only were they selling a miniature, it was in a diamond-encrusted frame, which I will show you. There it is, all right? So this is a Kussner miniature, and there are many wonderful things about this, but one of them, for me as an author and historian, it was sort of word of mouth that Amalia worked at Tiffany's. I never found a direct reference, though I felt it to be true, and I put it in my book. I just didn't have direct evidence. This is evidence. Her name is, you can't see it, but it's sort of very, actually you could, right here, it says Amalia Kussner. You can see that scribble there. And it's a frame from Tiffany's. We know she was there. She was there under a year. And you may say, why did she leave Tiffany's? Well, she left because she felt her miniatures weren't getting the attention that she wanted them to have. She wanted bigger and better things, so she left Tiffany's.
Is that Tiffany herself?
No, it's not. We don't know who this gentleman is, and that's maybe I'll talk about during the Q&A. It's on sale right now. If anybody wants it, it's going for $2,000 to $3,000 at Bonham's. So, after Tiffany's, she starts to network with various people, and one of the people she networked with was the Mrs. Havemeyer we saw a few slides back. she was told, Mrs. Havemeyer, was very influential in the art world in New York, so you've got to connect with her. She was given an introduction card, or whatever young ladies had in those days to get an entree into someone's house. She takes a few of her miniatures, very carefully bundles them up there in her purse or something. She goes to the front door of Mrs. Havemeyer's, and the maid is very dismissive. She says, I don't think Mrs. Havemeyer wants to see you today. She's not feeling well. And Amalia said, I'm good, I'll wait. Just, I'll come down here, you bring her my miniatures. She does, and Mrs. Havemeyer is tremendously impressed, and the rest is history. This is her big entree into the New York society. Now, let's say that was in 1893. In 1894, now she's got, starting to have a decent clientele in New York City, and she's invited to be at a charity benefit. This is for a children's orthopedic hospital, and it's through the National Academy of Design in New York City. And at least 10 of her miniatures are there. Now, another Indiana artist there is William Merritt Chase, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with him. So she's there with other prominent artists, which is very, very nice. I don't know that she cared that much about the children in this hospital, but this was a great marketing ploy for her. All right, here's one of the many photos I have of Amalia. Look at her pose here. Doesn't this tell you, hello world, here I am? And she has her hand on her hip, a little bit exposed, her décolleté, or whatever they call that, but this is just, someone is just ready to take on the world, and she does. Here's another photo. Now, you don't have to answer it, but if you were to look at this, what would you say she's dressed in? It's not a dress, is it? It's lace coming down here, it's toile or some sort of diaphanous fabric, and you may say, what is this striped thing on her lap? I think this is a tablecloth, and I don't mean that jokingly. I have tablecloths in the family that came over from Germany, and darned if they didn't look like that. So this became her trademark way to dress or wrap the women that she painted. She didn't want these, overly high-neck Victorian gowns. She wanted the women to have more self-expression, maybe be a little risque and very, very feminine, and this is how she dressed herself. Another thing I want to point out are these silk flowers, this bunch of silk flowers. They're not just there for decoration. They're hiding the pins and the fasteners to hold together all those wraps of fabric. And I always say on this, I said if a stiff wind came in that studio, it would be offer. This is the image that appeared on some of her brother Albert Kussner's music for Moon Moths. And by the way, if anybody's interested, if you go into YouTube and you Google Moon Moths, you'll find a gentleman who plays it. In fact, I've been in touch with him. He's a lovely older pianist. All right, now let's look at a little more at her artwork. This is the Mrs. William Astor, all right? She painted her, Mrs. Astor was already in her 60s, and Mrs. Astor was a vain woman, and I understand that. Amalia made her a little bit prettier. If you look at photographs, yeah, you're laughing, but that's what she wanted. If you look at photographs of Mrs. Astor at that time, her face is a little more plump. She had little teeny eyes. Sometimes people call them rat eyes, unfortunately. And they're lovely, large, expressive eyes. Also, we see this gorgeous choker, and I happen to know it's diamond and ruby, so the darker big gemstones are rubies. And what do we see here? We see the silk flower, and it's a wrap, so this is very typical. Here's some more portraits. On the left is the infamous Duchess of Marlborough, who was Consuelo Vanderbilt. Of course, that she was forced into that marriage. But look, she really captured, I think it's called piquant, or the very sort of innocent and beautiful look. She was a beautiful young lady, and I think Amalia really captured it here. Lady Allington, she also was part of the Marlborough set. She probably would have been friends with Minnie Paget. Might have been a very short-term mistress of Edward VII, but she was part of that gang. I want to tell you a very brief ghost story. Amalia painted Consuelo when she went to Blenheim Palace at the end of her honeymoon. Her honeymoon was 4 months. Everybody did 4-month honeymoons back then. And already her husband had used the money. I don't even think they'd been married a minute before he took that family money and started to refurbish and improve Blenheim Palace, because again, that was his motivation. The point of it is, you could not stay in the usual guest rooms in the main castle. You were off on like a side building, and the side building was always known to be haunted. Everybody knew it, right? So the story goes, and you can see this in the biography that, or actually autobiography that Consuelo wrote. Amalia's there, and she wakes up in the middle of the night. There's a ghost standing at the foot of her bed, and it writes that she left screaming in the room, "You've got to get me out of here." So I think it's sort of a cute and interesting story. All right, artistic styles and approach. I've already told you about the wraps that she would put her women in. These miniatures were very small, so I'm just gonna do a hand thing. They're often like this. Some of her miniatures were even smaller. She even painted on jewelry. There was a wedding that was done, a friend of hers, and Amalia painted the bridesmaids on things that big. And it's just incredible, incredible talent. Let's see, what else can we tell you folks? She painted in semi-darkness. So let's say this was the sitting room. Amalia would be by the window. She'd have light coming in. Obviously, she could only do this in daylight. She'd have her magnifying glass or very fine brushes. And then her sitters would be a little bit in the dark. She liked shading on the faces. She felt she could better see the features of somebody's face. And we know that she had this wrap technique. She even had a studio in New York City. We talk about it in the book. It was at the Windsor Hotel. And she had a sitting room where she had all these fabrics and wraps and the silk flowers that she could dress up for women. I will mention that her studio burned down in 1899. And the only reason she wasn't there, the whole building burned down, was that she was in Russia. We'll talk about that in a minute. But she was very fortunate not to be there. And again, the leaders of the Gilded Age wanted to be portrayed as royalty. The best collection of her miniatures are at the Swope Art Museum. Some of you know I was there last night and gave a presentation. I was so fortunate because they were able to take the miniatures out of storage. They're redoing the interior of the museum. They brought them out and they were actually there for everybody to see.
Where is it?
In Terra Haute, Indiana.
Oh, that is in Terra.
Yes, it is. So we're going to talk about the family she painted because it is very prototypical of the people of the Gilded Age. The father of this family was Charles Hammond Strong. He was native to Erie, New York. And as you can see, I've got here, he was first president of multiple coal companies, then president of the Erie and Pittsburgh Railroad. Of course, we know how big the railroad industry was then. And he went into other business ventures, including the newfangled technology of electricity, and even dabbled in publishing. He married Annie Wainwright Scott in 1881. She had her own money. Her family was well-to-do. And they had one daughter, Matilda Thora Wainwright Strong, in 1882. But Annie was like many other well-to-do women. She was very philanthropic. She wanted to use her money for good. And she built Erie's first nursing school for women, which I think is very impressive. I think these portraits were done in 1894, possibly at the Strong Mansion in Erie. Here is the Strong Mansion. Now I believe it is a university, a small liberal arts university. Many grand balls were held here. In fact, what I read in the Historical Society of Erie, that the balls here would rival those given in New York City. And 2 presidents visit here too. All right, this to me is Amalia's finest miniature. This is Annie Wainwright Strong. I saw it in person last night, so exciting. So let's break down what we're seeing here. We have a wrap, but we've got ermine fur. If you know anything about portraiture from Europe and England in the 1500s and 1600s, many of the royalty, their robes would have the ermine fur at the top. If you look at the coronation painting of Elizabeth I, her huge ermine cape, and the black there are actually the tails of the ermine animal. It's mostly white, but its tails are black. So here she's got, this royal fur around her, and then either like a pink silk or velvet, and she's, sitting against this very beautiful gold gilt chair. And there's a little hint of her bosom on the side. I never noticed that until I looked at it a couple of years later. So, ooh, we're being a little revealing. But I think women wanted this a little bit. They wanted to be a little risque. Amalia Kussner, you've got her signature right there. And then in her hair, you've got this beautiful twisting of pearls. I'm sure those pearls were fabulously expensive. Here is a close-up, and I really want to bring your attention to this image is less than 1 inch by 1 inch. Look at the hairs. and the depiction of the girls, but especially her eyes, it's almost photographic quality. Later, when Amalia goes to England, we'll talk about that in a minute, this portrait, Amalia made a copy of it, and it was on display at the Royal Academy of London. All right, British society and royalty. Let's talk about how Amalia ended up over there. She connected with Lady Paget, the dollar heiress we talked about earlier, and we know Lady Paget was part of then Prince of Wales, Marlborough set circle, and she gets a painting, an opportunity to paint the prince. And as I mentioned, he does give her a lovely necklace. I think in total, he gave her an emerald necklace, he gave her a pin of his prize horse Persimmon, which we'll see in a second, and also another necklace. And was she in any way a mistress of his? I don't think so, but they did meet up a couple of times, and there was supposedly exchange of letters. I think he was impressed by her. The Prince of Wales and later Edward VII, he was fascinated by the forthrightness of American women. He thought they were fascinating. And so she's now in British society. She's actually going back and forth a lot. She's painting many other ladies of British and noble society, and she starts to get connections outside of England. Oh, one other thing I want to mention. When I was doing my research back in 2020, I actually talked to an archivist at Windsor Castle, and I said, I would love to know, the whereabouts and where you have displayed the miniature that Amalia did of the Prince of Wales. And she goes, what miniature? And I said, well, the one that she did in 1897. She said, oh dear, I don't know what you're talking about. They have no record of that miniature, at least they didn't 5 years ago. There's a lot of mystery about some of the more famous miniatures she did, that now that the book is published, I want to see if I can track these down. So a number of mysteries here. All right, this is the miniature that the poor lady at Windsor Castle didn't know about. This is, again, he was the Prince of Wales at this time. This was for the Diamond Jubilee for Queen Victoria. This was the 60th year of her reign. He is in what's called a Knight of Malta costume. So this grand ball, the Devonshire ball, everybody had to come in costume. And that was pretty common in the Gilded Age. He came in costume. And Amalia just does a gorgeous job. We'll see in a minute the actual photograph of him. Just about everybody that went to this ball had their photos taken. These very, very beautiful black and white photos. I'm not sure what the photography technology was, but they're very crisp black and white photos. And these photos are at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I got a copy of the photo from them. You'll see here in a minute. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a piece of jewelry, we think, from Edward VII, and my mother was wearing it back in the 50s. All right, I guess I apologize.
Do you still have that piece of jewelry?
No, we don't. But I apologize, I don't have the picture in here of Edward. It's actually in the book, but the point I want to make, she beautified him a little bit, all right? He was a little pudgy in the face. She thinned the face down a little bit. He looks better in her portrait than he did in real life. Oh, let me go back here. All right, so 1899 was her great adventure year. This alone could be a movie, just an incredible, incredible year. She's invited to St. Petersburg initially to paint Duchess Maria. Now, Duchess Maria was married to Vladimir, who was the uncle of the then Tsar of Russia. It's all in the family, right? So she goes there in March, and she's there for 3 to 4 weeks. And then in October of 1899, she then goes down to paint Cecil Rhodes in South Africa in the middle of the Boer War. All right, let's talk about her visit to Russia. Again, like I'm saying there, she's invited by the Grand Duchess Maria. She actually arrives at her castle, which is separate from the Tsar and Tsarina's castle, the Winter Palace. And she's just about to set everything up, and there's a desperate knock at the door. And there is a messenger from the Tsar of Russia saying, well, he wants you to come paint him and his wife now, so you have to leave. So she profusely apologizes to Duchess Maria. In fact, we know all of this detail because she wrote about the visit to Russia in Century magazine in 1906. And I think you can find that magazine online, but it's certainly talked about in the book. So she is whisked off to the Winter Palace, but the odd thing is, as she is going through the various streets of St. Petersburg, she's noting noticing guards on the corners and that they're looking at her very intently as she passes by. Well, she learns that anybody visiting the Tsar is constantly watched, no matter where they are. In fact, at one point, one of the people in the castle said, "We really enjoyed that hat you bought." And Amalia said, "Excuse me? Yes, we were spying on you as you got that hat." So not too different, I guess, today by some people who visit Russia. And what was also interesting, when she gets to the Winter Palace, they're speaking English, which was interesting that they chose that to be the language of their family. She actually develops a friendship with Alexander. Alexander was a very private person. I don't think she ever really took to her role as queen with the Tsar. I mean, there's much more history there that you can read about. But I think Alexander just sort of lets Amalia into her life. Amalia gets close with the two children that are born at this time. The two daughters at that time are Olga and Tatiana. In fact, Alexandra is pregnant with Maria, 5 months pregnant, but it's never mentioned. She was a tall woman, maybe the pregnancy didn't show. After that, 2 years after that, Anastasia was born, and then after that, the doomed son, Alexei, in 1904. But there's a very sort of intimate exchange between Amalia and the Tsar and the Tsarina. The Tsar even talks to her about the Spanish-American War that's going on at this point. And like I'm saying here, the article in Century Magazine, it's like a 5-page article, and Amalia was, I think, an accomplished writer too. And of course, we don't know where these miniatures are, understandably, especially in this case. I don't think those will ever be found. And here's Tsar Nicholas. He's in a royal military garb here, and he is a dead ringer for George V. They're like first cousins once removed, but if you look at pictures of George V, of course they are related, as so many of these royalty were. All right, here's the Tsarina, and Amalia writes that there was a timidness, there was a shyness to Alexandra, so you can see she's looking down, but she also said that there was an inner strength that she did appreciate in Alexander. They stayed in touch over the years, and I know that when that family was assassinated, it must have been very, very difficult for Amalia. Visit to South Africa, all right? So in April of 1899, she goes back to London, and more of her time, by the way, is spent in Europe because she just feels more accepted in England and other European countries. She always wanted to paint Cecil Rhodes, and I found records that before her going to South Africa, she might have run into Cecil Rhodes, maybe at a function in London, and say, "I would very much like to paint you," and Rhodes said no. He had had a previous very bad experience with another artist, a miniaturist, hated what he did, this artist that is, and just didn't want to be painted. Amalia is very persistent, and I actually found a letter, this is a historical collection of Amalia's letters, written by the secretary of Cecil Rhodes. Will all right, he'll let you paint him, you just have to come down to Cape Town, South Africa, which she readily did. So she arrives in Cape Town, literally at the start of the Boer War. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Boer War, the Boers were the Dutch who had settled down there. The English obviously wanted the land. They've now discovered gold and diamonds. It was pretty much a land grab as part of what was going on with that war. Amalia arrives in Cape Town. She goes to the home of Cecil Rhodes. He's already left because now he's gone to the Kimberley diamond mines to defend that with other British soldiers. So what does Amalia do? Take a guess. She gets on a train and goes to Kimberley, right? And in fact, the train is stopped by the Boers. They come on, they're armed and everything. They inspect everybody on the train. They didn't see anybody with the military. They said, "All right, you can go on." Shortly after that, they bomb those train tracks. And when Amalia gets to the entrance to Kimberley, Rhodes very reluctantly lets her in. And she's also, I want to mention, with another woman who was a friend of hers, Nancy Houston Banks. Banks was on there on assignment to record the war. She was a journalist, actually with Vanity Fair of London. It was the British version of Vanity Fair. Rhodes lets both of the women in, and shortly after, the shelling into Kimberley starts. And wars were very different back then. The Boers would only bomb at certain times of the day, maybe to work around the British tea time, I don't know. But there was no bombing in the morning, and Amalia would paint Cecil Rhodes in the morning. I think later on, a month or two, it turned into a more real war. But the two women were stuck there, and there were all sorts of newspaper articles saying 2 women cooped in Kimberley, and I think I have a picture of that article in the book. Very, very dramatic. She finally does get out, and I think she leaves by donkey cart because the nearby train tracks are destroyed, finally gets to a working train, goes into Cape Town, and returns to London, but a lot of excitement. All right, her personal life. You've seen that she was a very beautiful woman. I think she could have any man in New York City, but I don't think she really wanted that at her stage in life. She wanted to promote her career. And she did know to some extent with a lot of men, if she got married, her career would have had to stop, and she did not want that. She did get interested in a young man. She had a trip to Paris in 1896, and Amalia at this point wore all the greatest fashions. You've probably heard the House of Worth. It was like the fashion company during the Gilded Age. So she's getting Worth gowns. She's in Paris, and through a variety of connections, she meets the Coder family, and they're two women, Coder women, who've married into royalty or Parisian royalty, and their brother is with them, Charles Dupont Coder. I don't think I've told you all yet, but Amalia lied about her age. When she started to become more popular in New York City, she made herself 10 years younger. She arrived in New York City in 1892, almost 30 years old. And by the time she meets Dupont Coder, she's, if I do my math right, maybe around 34, 35. He's like 22, 24, and she says, oh yeah, I'm your age. Yeah, we'll go with that. And he is from a very wealthy French Catholic family. Now, they're not a member of the 500 because those rules, you couldn't be Catholic or Jewish, but they're still a very prominent family, and their business is law. They have an international law firm called Coder Brothers. And, you know, Charles Dupont, being a good son, he too becomes a lawyer. But if you look at the arc, and she eventually does marry him, but if you look at the arc of their relationship, they don't see each other that much. Because at this time, Amalia's over in London, England a lot. As you know, she spent maybe a total of 4 or 5 months out of the country in 1899. Charles Dupont becomes a lawyer in 1898, but he also decides to fight with America in the Spanish-American War and is over in the Philippines for a year and a half. So when they finally do get married, and we'll talk about that in a moment, I don't think they were together that much, and they are married July 4th, 1900. So was this a marriage of love? No, it was not, at least not on her side. I think that she realized this could be a step up in terms of society and recognition. Even though this family was not a member of the 400, they were fabulously wealthy, they were internationally known. This would also help her connections in business in Europe for her portraits. And supposedly, Charles Dupont Coder, who I think did genuinely love her, his motivation to marry her, he said at the time, is going to make me a more respectable lawyer. They make this decision the morning of July 3rd, and they're married within 24 hours in the sacristy of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Now, as you might understand, all weddings back in the Gilded Age should have been grand affairs. This was not a grand affair. This was nothing more than almost going to a Catholic justice of the peace. She's not wearing a wedding gown. It's all very low-key for whatever reason. And shortly thereafter, they're on the Majestic. That was one of the famous White Star Line ships. And they're over to Europe. And in fact, newspaper articles said that Amalia kept all of her portrait appointments before she decided on this impromptu marriage. She already had business over in London, and on the honeymoon she did the business. So I am going to ask you folks a question. The Majestic, again, was part of the White Star Line. What was the most famous ship of the White Star Line?
Titanic.
You got it, the Titanic, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Yes, you got it. Okay, so just looking back in her personal life, did she date anybody before Charles Dupont Coder? Well, I happened to find through Googling that Nikola Tesla, the great inventor, was interested in her. There were like these intellectual luncheons that Amalia started to be invited to at the Waldorf, sort of an intellectual crowd of artists, obviously inventors. And in the biography about him, there were 3 women he was interested in at the time, and one of them was Amalia. And the biography states that she was so interested in his technology, she asked for a tour of his laboratory. I don't know if that happened, but, and I don't think they dated, but he was enamored with her. All right, another question for you folks. What was famous about John Jacob Astor IV? And he was son to Mrs. Astor. Anybody want to know how he died? That's right, that's right. there was one last lifeboat, or maybe one of the few, and he said, let the children go on it, and he went down. So I thought it was very admirable. And his wife, the second Mrs. Astor, was on the Titanic 5 months pregnant, and she makes it. I always think that's very touching. Okay, so again, I'm going to just go through this a little faster. This is a very mysterious marriage, all right? I found documentation. They did stay together until she died, and I found documentation that he went to great pains to give her a gift every year at their anniversary. But again, I think from her side, it was a marriage of convenience. Here's her husband. He was, I think, a very dedicated family man. He was dedicated to her. Would I call him handsome? Maybe not. But the one thing that I pick up when I read about him is how proud he was of his service in the Spanish-American War. After he came back from the war, he wanted to be called Captain Coder, not Mr. Coder. So I thought that was sort of impressive. There aren't many photos that we have of him. Okay, we've talked about her deception of her age. She brought that deception even into her passport applications, and I'll show you here. This is from Ancestry.com. It's not shown here, but above here, she has her birthday is 1873, 10 years later, and there is her signature. It's funny about Amalia's writing. I've seen letters that she's written, though she was a very wonderfully precise miniature artist, her writing was horrendous to read. Okay, her career in life after marriage. Like I told you folks, she kept working. And more of her work was over in England, and she became a little bit more particular. If you weren't somebody of society or a politician or had a lot of money, she wouldn't pay you. One of the, I guess the black marks on her life was a mysterious lawsuit in 1901. There was a woman by the name of Blanche Lincoln that issued a lawsuit against her directly. It wasn't she and her husband, but directly against her. The contents and anything to do with this lawsuit were highly secretive. The only thing I was able to research were who the lawyers were who represented her and the plaintiff, Blanche Lincoln. It was so mysterious. This woman, Blanche Lincoln, it's a pseudonym. It wasn't even her name. We don't actually know who the plaintiff was. The lawyer for Amalia had handled many, I would say, salacious, high-profile cases. One of the cases he had done a few years earlier, he defended Jay Gould and an erroneous paternity suit. Of course, women were always trying to claim that they had the babies of these wealthy men. Sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. He was already deceased at this point, Jay Gould, but it was his son now involved in the lawsuit, and Amalia's lawyer basically, got it resolved in the family's favor. So that was intriguing to me that you had a lawyer involved in these, salacious cases. I think there was some sort of indiscretion involved here. The amount of money that the plaintiff was asking for was $125,000. That's huge. And let's see here. One of the lawyers who the newspapers tried to interview said, we hope the public will never know. And in fact, this newspaper article comes from the Indianapolis newspaper in 1901. Amalia Kussner sued, I'll just read some of this, queer proceedings affecting the noted Indiana artist. And it says, legal mystery in the Supreme Court of the New York New York, of Mrs. Blanche Lincoln's suit. So the cause is not known of this lawsuit. All right, just a little local history now. This is an ad from Amalia's father's Kussner's Palace of Music from Terra Haute. I love this. All right, this is a fun thing. I found a book by a woman who came from Terra Haute. Her name was Winifred Harper Cooley. In fact, her mother, I don't remember her first name, but it was Mrs. Harper, was very involved in the Terra Haute suffragist movement and was connected with Susan B. Anthony. So a lot of interesting history. But there was this whole paragraph about Amalia's family. Her mother's sister married a Pence. He was a spiritualist, very, very popular at this time. And this is talking about a seance, but it also mentions Amalia Kussner. So I just wanted to show that. All right, Amalia and other notable women. Again, look at this picture of her compared to these other women. These are some other actresses, artists, such a dominant personality here. All right, other famous people that she painted. Lillian Russell was the companion of Diamond Jim Brady. Marie Tempest, Alice Keppel. She was probably the longest term mistress of Edward VII. In fact, she was actually allowed to come in as soon as he died. Not only was his wife there, but they allowed Alice to come in to see his body. Alice Keppel is great grandmother of Queen Camilla. Isn't that a hoot? Then we have Consuelo Vanderbilt, maybe even multiple miniatures were done of hers. Other European royalty, Queen Maud of Norway, she painted her also, and Gus Rodin. And you may say, how did Amalia connect with the Gus Rodin, the great sculptor? Her husband's sister had an affair with him, and it's all in the book. Quick time check, where are we at?
Yeah, we are right at 2:45.
Okay, I'm just gonna go a little longer here. Okay, her last 20 years, there isn't too much written about her. A couple of things happened, I think, that ended her career. Around 1911, she had been doing this artwork now for over 20 years. I think her hands were becoming a little arthritic. There's some indication that her eyes were failing, and you could see if you didn't have good sight and hands that you could manipulate these fine brushes, it wouldn't have worked. The other thing that I think occurred, Edward VII would have passed away, so all of her social connections might have dissipated, and when his son, George V, became king, he didn't really want to deal with those people. They were a little too wild for him. He didn't like all this mistress stuff. So I think in some ways she became unpopular as far as that goes. She died in the spring of 1932. A lot of historical articles written on her say she died of a lung ailment, but I found some local diplomatic papers she actually died of stomach cancer. And a family letter was given to me from the Weinhardt family. Again, the Weinhardt line through her mother was a Weinhardt, that her husband was tremendously devastated when she died. And as we mentioned, she did go to school at St. Mary of the Woods Academy. She sent them a letter in 1960, and I want to read this. When I go to America next, I shall visit the beloved school of my childhood. I shall not recognize it in its present grandeur, but the warm and tender hearts of the dear sisters will be unchanged. I was actually at St. Mary of the Woods Academy yesterday, and I learned that it was Sister Maurice, who was her art teacher there, and another sister. These were trained artists. For whatever reason, the Catholic Church actually sent them to art school, so they were accomplished artists in their own right, which I thought was interesting. So really, who was this woman, all right? She was brilliant, she was ambitious, and she was in the right time at the right place. Her career wouldn't have been what it was if she hadn't traveled to New York, which took some guts to do that. And she immortalized the Gilded Age illuminators. She made them appear to be the royalty that they wanted to be. Some articles, newspaper articles, say that she was a bit of a con artist. We do know that she lied about her age. She also claimed that she never had art instruction, which was a lie. She wanted to say just all natural, like natural brilliance. And of course, women who were very ambitious back then were sometimes not viewed very well. This is her signature. This is from a watercolor that we have. Before she specialized in miniatures, she did do some other couples of art, which we'll see more of. But look at her A and K in her signature. If you know anything about handwriting analysis, it's a very dominant personality. I love her signature. Now, this, we're going back in history a little bit. This she painted when she was in Terra Haute, maybe even in her late teens or early 20s. Back then, it was in vogue to have painted tiles on the mantelpiece, or the mantelpiece of a fireplace. This was for her aunt in Terra Haute. But look at this. This is really a very sensuous depiction of this woman draped over the crescent moon, a little bit of nudity there. And I just love this, and I wish she had done more artwork like this. This is very distinctive, but we own this. In fact, my daughter who's in the audience, this is actually her artwork. She inherited it. Now, oh, thank you for adding this in. When I was at the Swope Art Museum yesterday and I saw the miniatures directly, this is the one of the wife of the family, and what I saw, it's not quite clear in this picture, the top of the filigree on her miniature is a crown. It's not just, pretty ironwork, this is actually a crown. So thinking back upon that portrait, we're in this royal fur, if you will, with the ermine fur, and the frame has a crown, so what better to depict the royalty of America? All right, so you may say to me, Kathleen, have you ever done anything bold like Amalia? In fact, I have. Does anybody recognize the sort of balding gentleman on the right? And who is he, George?
Julian Fellows.
That's right.
You have it up there, I cheated.
You know, all right, you read it, all right. So he wrote, of course, Downton Abbey. He is now the writer of the HBO series, The Gilded Age. I found out that he was going to be at an event in Newport, Rhode Island. And I said, I've got to go to this. I told my husband, don't ask what these tickets cost. We paid for them, he put up with it. And at this point, he'd only done season 1 of The Gilded Age, and I thought, what a better person to be in his series but Amalia Kussner. So I wrote up a little biography about her, and he was very gracious. I went up and spoke with him, and I have to add, it was a stifling night in Newport, Rhode Island. It was like this fog bank coming in, everybody was woken. But I gave him this envelope, and he said, oh, thank you, dear, I'll make sure to look at this. Well, I never heard back, but I did try. But who knows, with the book out now, he may come back to me. We'll see. But it was a lot of fun. Okay, I want to thank many people for how this book came about. Many people were very generous with their images to me. Out of the blue, a year ago, the great nieces of her husband, Charles Dupont Potier, got in touch with me and gave me pictures. They gave me a picture of him in his uniform from the Spanish-American War, which is so valuable, it's in the book, and many other people. And my thanks to a couple of different branches of the Weinhardt family. The branch closest to me has given us 3 pieces of artwork. You know, we've got the Moon Lady, that beautiful one of the woman on the moon. And also other documentation. Another branch of the family gave me her will, some personal letters, so I understood what was going on with her husband at the time of Amalia's death. And I'll just briefly mention, did her husband remarry after she died? And if he did, who could possibly replace her? And it's in the book. And of course, a huge thanks to the Indiana Historical Society. It's such a joy to be here. It really is. All right, just a few more things. This is my social media. But if you can't remember or write this down, you could just go to KathleenLangone.com, and I have a contact page. I'd love to hear from you if you get the book. I always like to hear feedback. And I actually have 2 podcast series now. It was mentioned by Bethany, The People Hidden in History. I have just started up Searching for Amalia. And this is, again, trying to find all of these miniatures done of famous people, maybe find out the mystery of her lawsuit. I would love to do that. I may be going to New York to see if I can go through legal records. So we've got 2 series now. And they're all basically for free, like on Apple, Spotify. You don't have to pay to access these. All right, Q&A, folks.
Do you call your book just facts or historical fiction?
No, it's completely factual, as best as I could ascertain.
Okay, all right, I'm just, because I
It's a
belong
good
in
question.
different book clubs, so I just wondered how it was going to read. So, okay.
Yeah. Anybody else? All right, I guess we're done, and thank you so much for coming, and I do love it when people stay in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.